There's something quietly distinctive about people who grew up Gen X. Not loud, not flashy, not demanding attention, just different. Because Gen X didn't grow up in a world designed around them. They grew up in the gaps. And that psychological environment shaped a mindset that's easy to overlook, but impossible to fake. Let us start with the context most people forget. Gen X was raised during a transition. Old systems were breaking down, new ones had not fully arrived yet, and adults were often distracted, trying to keep everything afloat. Divorce rates rose. Dual-income households became normal. Institutions lost credibility. The message Gen X absorbed was not spoken out loud, but it was clear. Figure it out. This generation was not neglected, but it was not hovered over either. And that difference matters. Picture a weekday afternoon. School ends. You walk home alone or with friends. Maybe there's a key around your neck or hidden under a rock. You let yourself in. The house is quiet. Not scary, just quiet. You make a snack. You do your homework or don't. You turn on the TV. You exist without supervision for hours. That wasn't trauma. That was training. Psychologists call it autonomy under uncertainty. Gen X calls it normal childhood. And something happens when children regularly operate without adult oversight. They stop expecting rescue. They stop assuming someone else will intervene. They develop an internal decision-making system early. When things go wrong, their first instinct isn't, who do I tell? It's, what do I do? That's one of the core psychological traits of Gen X, self-directed problem solving. Not because they were taught it, but because they had to practice it daily. Now, let's talk about trust, or rather, the absence of blind trust. Gen X grew up watching institutions fail in real time. Political scandals, corporate downsizing, broken promises, authority figures who did not always know what they were doing. So instead of absorbing the belief that systems would protect them, Gen X learned something subtler. Systems are useful, but unreliable. That created a generation that does not automatically defer to titles or structures. They listen, and then they verify. They respect competence, not position. And they are deeply skeptical of hype. If it sounds too polished, too optimistic, too perfectly packaged, Gen X instincts kick in. They have seen behind the curtain before. This skepticism is not cynicism. It is pattern recognition. Now consider how Gen X learned emotional regulation. When something hurt, embarrassed, or disappointed you, there was no digital outlet, no instant validation, no algorithm feeding you reassurance. You went to your room. You closed the door. You sat with it. You replayed it. You processed it internally. That built something modern psychology is scrambling to relearn: emotional self-containment. Gen X learned that feelings do not need an audience to be real, that pain does not require immediate resolution, that emotions peak and pass if you do not panic. This is why Gen X often appears emotionally steady during crises, not because they feel less, but because they trust their ability to ride the wave without external support. They do not broadcast distress, they manage it. And that ties directly into another defining trait: low emotional dramatization. Gen X does not escalate easily. They do not catastrophize small problems. They have already lived through enough instability to know what actually matters. Now think about social development. Gen X friendships were built in physical space. If you wanted to see someone, you went to their house. If they weren't home, that was it. No tracking, no constant access. Relationships had natural gaps. Those gaps did something important. They prevented emotional overdependence. You weren't connected 24/7. So your identity didn't merge with your social circle. You learned how to be yourself, even when no one was watching. That created a strong sense of psychological independence. This is why Gen X is often misunderstood as detached or aloof. They're not. They just don't equate closeness with constant contact. For them, connection doesn't need continuous maintenance to be real. Another crucial factor, Gen X grew up analog but adapted to digital adulthood. That's huge. They learned how to think before technology thought for them. They developed memory without search engines, navigation without GPS, entertainment without infinite options. So when technology arrived, they didn't confuse it with identity. They saw it as a tool, not a lifeline. This created a rare mental flexibility. Gen X can operate offline and online without anxiety. They don't panic when systems fail, and they don't feel lost without constant stimulation. Their brains weren't wired on dopamine loops from childhood, so silence doesn't feel threatening. In fact, many Gen Xers crave it. Now let's talk about work ethic, but not in the tired, cliché way. Gen X doesn't glorify work. They don't define themselves by titles. What they value is competence. If you do your job well and don't create chaos, you earn respect. If you talk a lot and deliver little, you don't. This comes from growing up watching adults who worked hard and still struggled. Gen X learned early that loyalty to institutions isn't always rewarded, but skill is portable. So they invested in adaptability rather than blind commitment. That's why Gen X thrives in chaos. Layoffs, industry shifts, cultural changes. They adjust. They don't romanticize stability because they never fully trusted it in the first place. There is also something deeply understated about Gen X confidence. They don't announce it. They don't posture. They assume they'll figure it out because they always have. That confidence isn't loud, it's structural. And then there is humor. Dark, dry, self-deprecating. Gen X humor isn't about optimism, it's about realism. Laughing because things are absurd, not because they are perfect. Humor became a pressure valve, a way to metabolize disappointment without collapsing into bitterness. This is why Gen X often feels emotionally younger than their age. They didn't grow up being told how special they were, but they also weren't crushed by constant performance metrics. They developed a grounded self-image, flawed, capable, adaptable. Now look at how Gen X parents behave. Many of them hesitate to hover, not because they don't care, but because they know the cost of overprotection. They remember what competence felt like. They want their children to earn confidence, not inherit anxiety. They ask questions instead of giving answers. They allow discomfort. They tolerate boredom. Because they know that resilience isn't taught, it's discovered. At a deeper psychological level, Gen X carries something rare: low entitlement with high self-trust. They do not assume the world owes them anything, and they also do not assume they are powerless. That combination creates adults who are steady, realistic, and remarkably difficult to destabilize. They do not need constant reassurance. They do not require constant stimulation. They do not seek constant validation. They have already learned how to stand alone without feeling abandoned. And in a world that is louder, faster, and more reactive than ever, that quiet psychological independence is starting to look less like a generational accident and more like a missing skill. Gen X did not grow up being optimized for happiness. They grew up being optimized for reality. And that is why, decades later, they are often the calmest ones in the room when everything else starts to shake.